introduction. Also want to thank everybody here, everyone who helped organize this amazing conference. It's my first time here, and really just honored to be here. You know, I speak a lot at different colleges and universities and different things like that, schools, but one of the most moving experiences I've ever had as an educator, as a writer, as an artist, as a human being, took place in a prison. It was years ago, and I'm from Philadelphia originally, and that's what I'm talking about. I'm from Philadelphia originally, and you know, this prison that I'm talking about was outside of Philadelphia. And so I was asked to come and do a writing workshop, and I did. I went there, you know, way outside of Philly, and I get there, and all the guys are roughly my age, and there's one guy in particular whose writing just was amazing. His wordplay, his use of language, his vision, his ideas, everything was just on point. It was amazing to read, to be a part of that. And when I was done the workshop, I was allowed to go and see the cells. You know, I was given access to go see the cells where the prisoners spent the bulk of their days and nights. And I remember this one guy, his name was Jordan. I remember I got to Jordan's cell, and it looked different than all the other cells that I had seen. And I couldn't figure out exactly what was different at first. So I did a double take, then I did a triple take, quadruple take. What's it called if you do it 5 times? That's what I did. So I did all that, and the 5th time I realized what was different about Jordan's cell. And I immediately got enraged. I got really, really angry. And, you know, he was such a brilliant writer, and I was so upset at what I perceived to be the injustice that was occurring. He didn't have a bed in his cell, and it pissed me off. I said, you want me to go do something? You want me to raise hell in here? How come you don't have a bed? And he started laughing at me, you know. And he went underneath his bunk, and he showed me that he had this flimsy mattress under there. And he said, nah, man, it's cool, man. I've got something. I just don't sleep on it. So now I'm perplexed. I'm confused. Well, what do you sleep on, Jordan? He said, I sleep on the floor. I sleep on this steel frame. I sleep against the wall. Anything but not on that bed. So now I'm confused, like, why you got beef with the bed? You know what I mean? Like, what did the bed do to you? You know, I don't really get it. I'm totally confused. And so I asked him why. Why is it like this? And he gets, you know, his eyes filled with disquiet, and his body gets stiff and firm and intense, and he comes closer to me. And he says, MK, I don't sleep on that bed because I can't trust comfort in a place like this. He said, comfort in a place like this numbs you to the reality of where you really are and why. And so for him, for Jordan, sleeping against the frame, against the wall, all of these things reminded him in that raspy voice of reality where he really was and why. I thought a lot about that as I left, and I thought a lot about that since that moment. And a couple of different things have come out of that for me. The first thing that's come out of that for me is, as educators, as writers, as artists, it's very important sometimes to be uncomfortable, right? And so today, what I'm going to talk about is, in some ways, uncomfortable. I'm going to talk about my journey to transformation. I'm going to talk about my journey to independence. I'm going to talk about my journey to freedom. And it's an uncomfortable journey, but that's necessary. And I realized that talking to Jordan. I also realized a mantra for me came out of that moment. So now I have the mantras that I live by. If you make an observation, you have an obligation. You make an observation, you have an obligation. It rhymes, it's simple, but I like it so much because in so many ways it's been so instrumental to everything that I do in my life, you know? It's always about converting or transforming that observation into an obligation, right? I observe something. How come we don't have this? How come this doesn't exist? How come there's no book that talks about an urban boy's journey to an independent school and how it saved his life? How come there's no book like that? Because MK, you didn't write it yet. right? How come there's no book that da-da-da-da-da-da? Because you didn't write it yet. How come there's no program? Because you didn't make it yet. So all of this has been influential in my life in terms of how I think and how I see the world, which leads me to my story and my journey, a buck wild journey, getting to independent school, getting to freedom, getting to liberation. To me, they're all connected. I named my story Buck. Young buck, buck wild, buck shots, buck town, slave buck, black buck, make buck, buck now. I named it Buck because, you know, buck encompasses all those things for me, right? I'm a young buck. I was a young buck, right? I was buck wild. And that's such an important part of my journey is losing control, right? Losing myself in order to find myself, right? When I say buck shots, I'm from Philadelphia, and I heard a lot of claps and stuff. But how many people know about Philadelphia, Pennsylvania? Right? That's where I'm from as well, right? I'm from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, but I'm also from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, right? So when I say buckshots, I'm talking about the violence that destroyed my community, the violence that took away my best friend, the violence that took away my brother, the violence that took away my cousin, the violence that took away my neighborhood, right? When I say Bucktown, that's an old school hip hop reference because hip hop in many ways is the soundtrack to my journey. You know, every journey, every story needs a soundtrack. In fact, when I told people I was coming here, they were confusing it with the new NWA movie. I said, nah, this is different. Straight out of Seattle, but, so, Bucktown. Then we got slave buck, black buck. You know, I wanted to remind people that buck used to be a derogatory term for black people back in the day, you know, especially during slavery. Buck was a derogatory term. So when I say slave buck, make buck, I'm talking about the racism that was and the racism that still exists, you know. When I say make buck, I'm talking about entrepreneurship and classism and all those kind of realities that come with our education, our coming of age. And then I say buck now, which I'll come back to later. But then there's also the notion of buck naked. And being buck naked is very important in a lot of ways. I know you guys, where's it going with this? Buck naked. But, you know, writing a memoir, Buck is my first memoir. And writing a memoir is like getting buck naked, basically, because, you know, you become very vulnerable. It's like exposing yourself to the world, right? Things that you might not want people to see or want people to know about, your family, your life, your history, all of that's out in the open now, you know? And so, in a lot of ways, you are very vulnerable. And what's so interesting, and I'll come back to this a little bit later, but we're always taught that vulnerability is weakness. Vulnerability is something that makes us weak. But what I learned is that vulnerability actually, this kind of vulnerability made me strong. And that's the kind of thing that I think we can teach to our students, right? Is that being vulnerable doesn't have to be synonymous with weakness. It's actually something that can give us strength, that can give us power, right? In the book, I talk about feeling unforgettable, right? And that's what can do it, right? Vulnerability can make us feel unforgettable sometimes. So, has anyone ever felt unforgettable? Okay. So my story starts in Philadelphia. It was very important for me to tell this story of education, of transformation, of my journey. It was very important to me not to tell it from the perspective of me now, right? Looking back as a college professor, you know, back in the days, I used to be buck wild. I didn't want to write that kind of a memoir. I wanted to write a memoir that was immediate. I wanted to write a book that was urgent. I wanted to tell a story that felt like right now. And so I told this story from the first person present tense, right? I told the story from the first present tense. And so what that does is it makes you feel like you're writing it with me at 13 years old. So the book opens up, the fall in Philadelphia. Outside is the color of cornbread and blood. Change hangs in the air like the sneaks on the live wires behind my crib. Such an important opening because my whole life, you know, in the opening and the introduction, Emily talked about how we don't know what's going on in people's lives. Well, it's so interesting because since this book has come out, I've had so many teachers and students who I used to go to school with write me and say, oh my God, I had no idea that you were going through all of that when you were going through all of that, right? And so there's oftentimes this complete disconnect between what we're going through and the place that we spend the most time, which is school. And so for me, like I said, the journey starts when I'm 13. My brother, who I adore, I look up to my big brother. His name is Uzi. He's the color of walnuts. He has a long, sharp face like the African mask my dad hangs up everywhere. And this is the guy I follow everywhere. I want to be just like my brother. In the opening of this book, opening of my journey, my brother is incarcerated. He's locked up. The police come to our house. Break down the door. They take my brother away. They rough me up. My mom, who's this strong woman from Brooklyn, who's endured so much, who's been through destitute poverty, she can't take it anymore. She's been through so much, and she really has a mental breakdown. My mom, through this whole story, is suicidal, constantly taking attempts on her own life. My father leaves, and so we have a situation, and that's where we get the Buck Wild situation from, right? Because there's a lot of people in my life that are missing, that are gone, and one of the things that I did in this book and in my story is I integrated my mom's diary entries into the story. And it's so interesting what she says about education. Because, yes, I'm a tenured professor at Morgan State. I know I look really young. But I was kicked out of, I know, right? It's the elephant in the room, right? I mean, people ask me today if I went to this school. So I told them I graduate in May. But the thing that's so interesting, so I used to read my mom's diary. Me and her, we didn't talk a lot. So I would read her diary when I was young, and that's how I would understand what was going on in her world. She would talk about drugs. She would talk about life in Brooklyn. She would talk about my father and her divorce and all these things that were very personal, her weight, just the most personal things you can imagine. And so what I did in this book is I interspersed my mom's journal entries in here because we wanted to open up a conversation about education and mental health and family. Because a lot of times we don't talk about the mental health issues that are also affecting our children. And so I want to give you an example of kind of where my mom was. And so here's a journal entry that my mom wrote about the public school system that I was a part of. She says, and she always wrote, "Dear Carol." That's how she started each entry. She says, "Dear Carol, Philadelphia public schools are notorious in many ways, and I need to protect Milo as much as I can. He's been stoic throughout all of this, but I wonder what is going on with him inside. My mind is on the future and determining what school Milo will attend. Education for me was always the key, and I assumed that my sons would feel the same way. After all, African Americans have made great strides, but we still have far to go. That is my dream for my children, but reality is seeping in as they let me know in many different ways that they don't want to follow. Like Daoudi, Milo was expelled from the 7th grade, and like Daoudi, he has picked up on the thug life." Anyway, my mom goes on and she talks about, the perils of my education and kind of just all the stress that she's under. And so part of the book talks about all the different experiences and different schools that I attended. In so many ways, Buck, when I say Buck, I'm talking about education. Buck is a story about education. It's about my miseducation, my re-education, my street education, my self-education. It's about the realization for me, as a young person, between the distance between school and education, right? The realization that school and education can be as close or as distant as sex and love. That's what occurred to me at a young age. And so I write about different school systems. I started out in a friend's school that we call Foes. And I'll just quickly talk a little bit about that, and I'll read you a quick passage from that. It said, "My parents sent me to this school because it's supposed to be better than my neighborhood schools in Alma that most of my boys go to. But better how? All we do is memorize stuff and spit it back like robots. It's called friends, but it should be called foes. They act one way to your face, but behind closed doors, it's another story. Like how someone wrote nigger inside my locker when I was suspended. I have no idea who did it because nobody asked the part. And so I was in this school, and that didn't work out. In fact, it was funny. Recently, I did an event, and there were some people from from the school I was kicked out of, and they came up after and they said, we would love to get you to come back and speak. But they didn't have the budget. I told them the budget. You're gonna have to pay me a lot of money. I also want to talk about, so part of what makes me, I think, is the different educational experiences that I've had, right? First of all, when I talk about street education and self-education and re-education, I'm really talking about the notion that, the whole world is a university, so I was educated, the barbershop and the corner, anybody could be a professor. That's the way I look at the world. Anybody could be a professor. So, I saw a guy one day, a homeless man on the street. He asked me if I knew what soul was. I said, Soul Train? And he said, no. He said, soul is the graceful survival against impossible circumstances. People like him are professors to me, I don't have any loans connected to that. It's just complete love. So there's professors everywhere, there's teachers everywhere, and part of what I do is really kind of open up and just be receptive to it all. I was also in the pipeline system, and I know a lot of you are familiar with the pipeline system, right? The school to prison pipeline. A lot of schools are preparing our children for higher education, for jobs, for careers, but some of the schools that I went to in Philly it was very clear what was going on. It was a school to prison pipeline. There's, it's obviously been documented, the correlation, the incestuous relationship between the private prison industrial complex and, schools, government officials, all that. So in this, I want to just read to you a little bit about that system. I went to a school called Fells in Philadelphia, and this chapter is called The Pipeline. I said, we pour into Fells High like syrup, steady and slow. This school looks just like jail. I wonder why mad schools look like jails. Or do jails look like schools? The jail Uzi's in, Uzi's my brother, the jail Uzi's in is actually nicer than this. If schools look like prisons and prisons look like schools, will we act like students or prisoners? Police roam the hallways, whirling nightsticks like band directors. The windows are tinted with bars. There's no sunlight like we're in a casino, and you never win in here either. At my old school, foes, the teachers always fucked with me. At Fells, the teachers don't know who the fuck I am. It's overcrowded like Amistad. Fells is the opposite of my old school, foes. They say Foes is one of the best schools in the city. They say Fells is one of the worst. Foes, private, Fells, public. Foes, mostly white, Fells, mostly black. Foes' kids' parents got tuition money. Fells' kids' parents ain't even got lunch money. So part of my educational journey was really seeing the disparity in the school system, in the teachers, and socioeconomics. All of this was really part of kind of what made me who I am and what made me see things about education. And so at the end of this chapter, I say, I never stayed longer than fifth period. There's really no point. There's no learning going on at Fells, just rules and yelling and chaos and screaming correctional officer teachers. I feel like I can learn more outside of these dead school walls. And so education for me, school, became this thing that was always confrontational. It was always hostile. There was no more learning going on. There was no learning going on. I either saw it as rote memorization and regurgitation, or like the school that I described there was a holding cell in the basement of the school. So you could literally go to jail and be in school. And so I started to see education like this. And so when I got kicked out of that school, I didn't go back to school. And I was done with school. And I'm just going to kind of speed up my story a little bit and talk to you about some of the biggest transformational moments that really changed me and changed my life and how it relates to independent schools. So I'm not in school, and I'm going to save you some of the details of the book, but a lot of the book deals with the darkness of the streets and being in Philadelphia, being on, not being with my mom, not being with my dad, being on the streets. Getting involved in all the things that you don't want your children, that you don't want your students to get involved in, right? So the violence, the drugs, the street, the sex, all of that stuff in the streets of Philly. So just chaos, right? And I'm in Texas. We wind up in Texas. Me and my friend, he was 16 years old. I was 16 years old. He came to me. He was on the run. And we thought it would be a good idea from Philadelphia to drive to Texas. So we drove to Dallas, 25 hours, Dallas-Fort Worth. I had a cousin there. We just thought that was a great idea. And we went there, and while I was there, my mom had a overdose, right, in Philadelphia. And so I get I am older than you think, because I got a beat. They paged me. And they paged me. I was in Texas, and they said, when my cousin paged me and said, your mom. So I called, and we had an issue. We drove back to Philadelphia from Texas, and when I got to Philadelphia, my mom was in the hospital. She had tubes and systems all in her, and really just bad shape. The doctor said she, narrowly escaped death. And when I was there, I'm talking to my mom, and my mom says, Marlo, you have to go to school. Education is your passport to the future. I said, my defense, I didn't like school at the time. I said, my defense then, I said, Mom, I would go to school, but no school will take me. Because, the fellas kicked me out, so nobody's going to take me after that. And my mom said, well, if I find a school that will take you, will you go? And she's in the hospital, she's got the tubes all up in her, the machines, I don't want the machines to start going off, you know what I'm saying? So, of course I'll go, Mom, you know what I'm saying? What am I going to say at that point? So, yes, I'll go. And I didn't think she was going to really find a school. Who's going to take me at this point? So, a couple weeks later, my mom finds a school. I'm back at home with my mom. And she tells me, at the time, she says, I found a school for you. It's an alternative school. I said, okay, cool, whatever, Mom. Some of the schools that I went to in my journey looked like prisons, looked like warehouses, looked like jails. And then some of them, like this school, looked like a gingerbread house. It was completely different than anything I'd ever seen. I remember I got there, and I was immediately, it was very different. And I gotta say this is the most candid, raw thing I could say. To this day, I've never seen a more interesting, but really weird collection of individuals. Like, this is the weirdest school ever. And for me, coming from where I was coming from, a traditional, this was like, whoa. There was a kid who was banging his head against the wall, and he was using his blood to make a painting. And, it was very deep. It was very deep. But anyway, so I thought to myself, if this is an alternative school, I'm not this alternative. This is and it's interesting. We're obviously here today, and we're talking about, independent schools. I didn't realize back then, and I don't think my mom realized then either, that this wasn't an alternative school, this was an independent school. But anyway. So I'm at this school, and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna make this work for my mom, but I don't want to be there. I don't want to be in school, but I stick it out. And one day I'm in this class, and the teacher puts blank pieces of paper in front of everybody, and she says, "Okay, class, now write." And everybody starts scribbling fast like reporters at a press conference. Everyone's just doing their own thing, and I'm just sitting there. At this point in my career as a student, I haven't done a lot of work recently, in the last few years. So I don't really respond well to orders and, or to even, just prompts. So I'm just sitting there, and she comes over to me and she says, write. And I said, well, what do you want me to write? And she says, well, write anything you want. And that just struck me as so odd, but also as some real BS. Like, people say sometimes, people say things all the time that they don't really mean, Hey, how you doing? You know what I mean? They don't really mean it. If you really told them all the problems in your life, they would back out, So it's like, so people say things, people say, hey, how do you feel? But then if you tell them how you feel, it's not always good. So she said, write whatever you want. I said, oh, write whatever I want? Okay, I got something for you. So I wrote, fuck school. And I wrote it as big as possible. Just fuck school. And it felt good to actually write that. And I thought that by writing that, I was going to be kicked out of class, of course, and sent home, which would be a good thing because my friends were home. They weren't going to school either. And I would have just hung out. But instead, the teacher looked at my words and said, good, now keep going. Yes, give her a round of applause. And that messed my head up. I wasn't expecting that. So let me talk to you about what happened after that. I turned the page over and it's blank again. The blank page is the starter pistol that fires and triggers my mind to sprint. What will I write? How will I start? Whose story will I tell? What about a story about a boy from Philly? A lost boy who wants to find himself but doesn't know where to look. Who wants to tell his story but doesn't know where to begin or end. Who searches anyway and discovers something about himself, about the world. I stare at the blank page, an ocean of white, alive with possibility. I hear myself take a breath, then exhale, deep like I just rose from underwater. It's like I'm at the free throw line again, foul shots, like the game is on the line again. I remember something my dad told me, shoot to make it. My hand is shaking now, trembling like it's freezing, and then it hits me, a silence louder than all the music I've ever heard in my life, all the light in the world in one beam before me. I grip the pen and something shoots down my spine, sits me straight up. The pen feels heavy, like it's made of stone. At exactly which point do you start to realize that life without knowledge is death in disguise? I stare deep into the blank page and see myself. I feel something I've never felt before, purpose. I don't know what my exact purpose is yet, but I know it has something to do with this pen and this blank page. I am a blank page. Holding the pen this way, snug and firm in my fist, makes me feel like I can write my future, like I can spell out my destiny in sharp strokes. The blank page begs me to tell a story, dares me to tell one that's never been told before, and to tell it like it will never be told again. The blank page lights up a room in my heart that I didn't know existed. I'm standing outside of Krefeld, my independent school, staring into the endless green of Wissahickon Park when my purpose finds me. A voice in my head, let the beauty of what you do be what you love. So anyway, that was the moment. The blank page saved me. America enraged me. Then she paid me. New slaves, old slavery. My grandma told me the streets far from holy. Now I'm lonely. My homie's bodies is holy. The blank page is what saved me. And the blank page activated things. So it was really interesting. So I did this writing assignment. I was really starting to enjoy this. So every day I would come to class, I would write. So one day my teacher says, hey, Marlo, that's what they call me. He said, Marlo, you kind of like this writing thing, huh? And, I was 16, So I was like, I mean, it's cool. But inside, and that's what I mean about that vulnerability, right? I wasn't ready yet to be like, oh my God, I love this. You know what I mean? I live for this, I was just still I mean, it's cool. Because I didn't know how to be vulnerable about, I really love this stuff. I want to read and write. And so anyway, so to be a good writer, I had to be a good reader. So she gave me a book one day, came in the next day, I said, can I get another book? She said, read the book I gave you yesterday. I said, I read it. She looked at me like, come on, Milo. I said, I read it. So I started reciting some of the book, and she said, oh, you read it? I said, yeah, I read it. I said, I was like someone in the desert, thirsty, I needed the nourishment. I felt like I needed to catch up. And then I had an epiphany, an amazing epiphany. I say, I write about it. I say, oh, now I see why reading was illegal for black people during slavery. So, because that's very interesting. I used to hear things like that. The older people would say things like, back in the day, reading used to be illegal for black people during slavery. And, you would hear it, but it didn't really mean anything to me until I started to really think about that reality, right? That reality of, hey, how you doing, Jackie? Jackie, back in the day, me and you could be in jail, and you could be like, hey, MK, what you in here for? And I'm like, yo, Jackie, I was on chapter 10, and they, and the door, they kicked in the door, you know what I mean? It's like to really think about that was illegal. We're in the car, and the cops, we gotta hide the books, we gotta put the books in our butt crack, and then somebody has to read that one day. I mean, you think about the reality of this is so crazy. And for me, as a high school student, I started to realize why. Now I see why reading was illegal for black people during slavery. I discovered that I think in words, right? I sub-vocalize. So the more words I know, the more things I can think about. My thoughts and my vocabulary grow together like the stem and petals of a flower, right? Reading was illegal because if you limit someone's vocab, you don't just limit their vocabulary, you limit their thoughts. They can't even conceive of freedom because they don't have the language to access that, And so for me, that became my liberation, that became emancipatory for me. And so everything I did, in terms of writing and reading became part of my liberation, my emancipation. And that's really what I take into the classroom today. I was inspired and influenced by people like Paulo Freire, who say, the purpose of education is either two things, to either maintain the status quo or transform it. And so for me, that notion of transformation has been so important, not only on a personal level, right, but also on an institutional level, on an educational level, on a societal level, that it's not just about me changing and me finding my purpose, but it's about all of us doing that, all of us doing something with meaning and finding who we are and finding out our voice and all of this stuff. So for me, that became what I take, the energy that I take into the classroom. The energy of change, the energy of transforming observations into obligations. I talked earlier about buck now, that's really what the book is about. It's about bucking the stereotypes, bucking the traditions that don't work, bucking the status quo. It's about teachers being buck, educators being buck. It's so important. One of the things that always inspired me is a story, old preacher story about, there's a blind woman, and the children go to this blind woman's house, and the children say, we have a bird in our hand, is it dead or alive? And the blind woman, she can't see, but she has vision, and she said, which is different, and she says, I don't know if that bird is dead or alive. There's only one thing I know. And the children are like, well, what is that thing? And she says, it's in your hands. And when I think about just education and my journey, when I think about independent schools, and when I think about all the students, when I look at everyone in here in the audience, I see thousands of students, you know what I mean? And when I think about all of that and that future, if someone were to ask me, where are you guys going? It's the honest answer is, I don't know. But there is one thing I know, and that it's in our hands. We can choose to crush that bird, or we can choose to let it fly and go to heights that we haven't even imagined yet. So it's in our hands. Thank you very much.